Content warnings. Abusive authority figures. Mentions of substance abuse. Spiders and arachnophobia. Please listen at your own discretion. The Usher Foundation, Episode 14. Cocooned.
Knock, knock. Richard?
Well, Miss Palmer, yes. Sorry. Busy. Busy. Hello. Sorry, what is it? What do you need?
Sorry to bother you. I just wanted to see if you could let Amita know her tape recorder's broken. I think it's turning on by itself. Maybe something's wrong with the record button. I'd tell her, but she's at lunch and I'm leaving early today.
Oh, yes. Of course. I'll let her know.
Great. Thanks so much. Richard, when was the last time you left your office?
What do you mean?
Nothing. Sorry. It just seems dirty in here. Maybe you should get a cleaner in here. Get rid of some of those cobwebs. Right. Okay, my turn. Statement of Parker Conlan, age 68, at time of statement number 02176801. Summary of statement: the Blackbird stage production disaster. Statement recorded by Kaylee Palmer, archival assistant at the Usher Foundation of Paranormal Research, Washington, D.C. Statement as follows. The first thing you need to know: I had no idea what was going to happen that night. I was just a light man, a techie. I worked with so many people, I reported to a completely different person than the actors did. Sure, technically we had the same director, but Mendoza hardly ever spoke to any of us in tech. I'm sure you've heard of the Blackbird. Maybe not, it was a long time ago. I'll bet you've at least heard of the writer and director John Mendoza. They teach his works in school now, and I'll bet you've read at least one of his plays. I once had to go to one of those parent-teacher meetings for my granddaughter, and her English teacher had him right on her shelf, smack dab in the middle of Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller. What a joke. I hated Mendoza. I hated the insipid little comments he constantly made to the actors. I hated how dismissive he was to my fellow tech members. I hated how he would fly into rages if things didn't go his way. He had a vision, you understand, of precisely how he wanted every single detail to look on stage. I've worked with dozens of directors for all kinds of productions, and I've met some real pieces of work, but Mendoza was easily one of the top 5 most awful people I've ever worked with. There was this one rehearsal where halfway through the show he stood up from his special chair, because of course he brought his own director's chair. He couldn't just sit in the actual theater seats like all the other production leads, and he started screaming that none of it was right. The lighting, the choreography, the acting, the actors, it was all wrong. Mind you, he's the one who insisted on every single detail. He blew off the handle and even broke a light fixture. I was one of the saps who had to clean up that mess. He changed everything on a whim, and he did it all the time. Thankfully, I didn't report to him directly. Our poor tech lead had to deal with him the most. Oh, her name was Rosanna Conway, but she passed away a year or 2 ago. Heart attack, I heard. I once witnessed him lecture her about getting her spots timed correctly. I was so angry I had to walk away before I did something that would get me fired. I worked with Rosanna a long time, probably about 7 years, and never once had she missed her lighting cues. She was a damn fine boss and a wonderful production lead. She'd certainly worked in stage production longer than John Mendoza. I won't go into detail here about the actual plot of The Blackbird. It's not important to my statement, and I wasn't really a fan, actually. I know it's considered a modern classic, but I never liked dramas. No, I'm here to tell you about the evening the production fell into chaos, and all the things leading up to that night. The things I know about, anyway. Things that I didn't put together until many years after opening night. The media didn't interview the tech teams. They never thought to. I suppose usually they want to talk to the actors, and they did speak to a few of the extras, the ones who weren't on stage at the time. If they had interviewed the tech teams, I think maybe the story in all the papers would have been a little different. Sure, none of us knew what would happen that night, but I can't deny that the entire production of The Blackbird was strange. For starters, a lot of the production for the show involved cables. Now, I know what you're thinking. Cables are a natural part of plays. You've got cords for microphones, cables for lights, all sorts of wires for every piece of technology working behind the scenes of a show. But that's not what I mean. I worked in theater tech for most of my life, and when I say that there were an unusual amount of cables being used in The Blackbird, I mean there were a lot. No one knew precisely how they were getting backstage, but you could see them everywhere. Thick, black, glossy cables of various widths, winding and twisting on the ground, leading to God knows where. They seemed to stretch into every corner of the theater. Every rehearsal there seemed to be more and more of them, sprawled across the floor, reaching into the high catwalks where us techs scurried around. Leading up to that first show, they got so numerous that I saw huge bundles of tangled black masses entwined up the walls themselves. Another man I worked with, Jack Livingston, asked Rosanna about them once, trying to figure out where they were coming from or what they were powering. Apparently she gave some vague response that didn't really explain anything and left. I followed the cables once. I was in the theater by myself. There was no rehearsal that day, but I wanted to work on some of the lighting issues we'd been dealing with, routine stuff mostly. I was crossing the stage and wasn't watching my step, and I tripped hard over a mass of wires coiled on the stage. I wanted to kick them away angrily, but I didn't. A strange sensation came over me. I don't know how to explain it, but I suppose the whole point of writing a statement is to try and do just that. How could I describe it? It was like a slow, icy numbness filled my head. The theater suddenly seemed very dark, and I suddenly felt very alone. My eyes traced that tangle of cables. They didn't seem like regular wires just then. At that moment, they felt alive. Alive and hungry. I didn't realize my body was moving on its own. I swear to you, I didn't feel my legs moving slowly, following the path of those cords, until I saw them leading into some place in the back of the theater I had not seen before. The dim lights did not reach whatever corner this was, and I swear, you're going to think I'm making all of this up, but I swear I saw something in that blackness. Something large. I thought I saw dripping fangs and glinting eyes. I think it was the fear that snapped me out of whatever trance I'd found myself in. Pure terror and disbelief jolted through my legs, and I found myself in control of my body again. I simply turned around and bolted. I didn't go to work at the theater alone again. So that was one odd thing about the production. The hungry cables. Another thing was the actors. I can't remember all their names, but two of the main leads were Susan Kenyon and Tony Pearson? I don't know anymore. They're dead now, of course, but I remember what they were like before they died. Shockingly decent, for one thing. In theater, you tend to meet a lot of actors who think they're the next Broadway king or queen, or worse, the next big name for the Royal Shakespeare Theater. What I mean to say is, a lot of theater folks take the phrase, all the world's a stage, a little bit too literally. But Tony and Susan were nice. I mean, they had their moments, all actors do in my experience, but they were polite to the tech crew, and they really did know their stuff. The both of them had wonderful on-stage chemistry. Privately, I think they carried most of the show, but that's just me. The problems with Susan and Tony, and the rest of the lead cast really, started about halfway through the rehearsal schedule, about the time the cables started to mysteriously multiply. They came into rehearsals late, they looked exhausted all the time, they fumbled lines and stage directions they had previously nailed every time. There was one rehearsal where Tony had to ask for his line 25 times. If you had any theater experience, you would know that that's an absurd number of times to be missing your lines, especially for a lead actor halfway through rehearsals. Another time, Susan fainted on stage, just dropped like a stone in Act 2 of the show. We had to call an ambulance, stop the entire rehearsal. Mendoza was steaming, of course. Rumors were going around that a lot of the main cast had been practicing their lines together on their own time, and that a lot of these private rehearsals had a lot of booze and a lot of drugs. I remember hearing this and being skeptical. I hadn't spent a lot of time with Tony or Susan, but I knew a lot of actors who fell into addiction, and they didn't seem the type. Still, looking at the dark circles under their eyes and the new thinness of their wrists, I don't think I would have outright denied drug abuse. None of that was even the weirdest thing that happened. All that can be chalked up as normal. Unfortunate and tragic, sure, but there's hardly anything strange about a theater cast getting dangerously intertwined with each other's lives and shooting up a lot of heroin. I know that sounds scandalous, but this is theater we're talking about. It's not exactly uncommon. No, it was the conversation I had with Susan the night before our first show that gave me pause. It was Tech Week. Everyone was stressed and everything was hectic. If you've never been involved in theater, Tech Week is a nightmare for the entire crew, the one time when the cast and the production team really feel united in their misery. It was the last rehearsal before our first show, and we were on a short break between acts to grab food, drink water, use the restroom, all that stuff. I was running backstage to grab a replacement mic for someone, and I saw Susan sitting on the ground. She was staring off into the distance, dazed and unfocused. A bottle of water was tipped over on the floor next to her, and the water was slowly pooling around her feet. I cautiously called out her name. She didn't respond, and I hesitated to move closer to her. There was something about the way she was staring, see? I thought she was staring off into space, daydreaming, or maybe even that she had shown up to work high, but I traced her eyeline. Susan was staring into a dark corner. A cold chill crawled up my arms, raising the hairs there. The corner she was staring at had masses of black cords, twisting into the darkness. If I looked at it for too long, I could feel a familiar, icy numbness sluice over my mind, could feel my limbs try to walk towards it against my will. Susan wasn't staring off into space, I realized. That dazed look in her eyes wasn't caused by drugs or overexhaustion. It was terror. Complete, total, all-encompassing fear. I managed to tear my gaze away from where Susan was looking and turn back to her. This time I did walk up to her. I knelt down and gently picked up the empty plastic water bottle and set it next to her, then grabbed a nearby dress? Some bit of costuming no one was using, and tried valiantly to mop up the water. I managed to get most of it, actually, and was about to offer to help her up when Susan grabbed my wrist. I nearly jumped out of my skin in surprise. Her eyes were alert and urgent as they locked onto mine. Her grip was like a clamp. I tried to tug myself from her grasp, but she just tightened her fingers. I was trapped, and becoming more panicked by the second. I didn't like the look Susan had on her face. She looked erratic. "Susan, please let me go," I said, and I tried to keep my voice calm and clear. I'll never forget, for as long as I live, what she said to me in response. Susan leaned in very close, so close that our noses were almost touching. I could smell cigarettes and Altoids on her breath. "Every time I try to stop, it makes me do it again," she whispered. "It won't let us stop. Don't you see? It won't let us stop." She raised her other hand and pointed to the dark corner. I swallowed and tried not to look. "Don't you see it?" she breathed. That was enough for me. I wrenched myself from her grip and stumbled away, practically running back to the safety of the tech crew. When I dared to glance over my shoulder, Susan was silent, but she was still pointing. I went back to work and avoided her for the rest of the night. I suppose there's no getting around it now, is there? We're at the point in my story where I have to tell you about the night the lead cast all died on stage. Thinking back on it now is strange, because up until Act 2, everything was normal. Doors opened at 6 o'clock, so of course we were all there at around 3 in the afternoon, running equipment checks and getting things ready. The cast arrived around 4 o'clock to do last-minute costume fits, run lines, and practice some of the more difficult scenes. Audience started filing in as soon as the doors opened, and the show started at 7. There were no issues with the mics, lighting, or decor, and everything was normal. I swear to you, everything was normal. I remember relaxing as I beamed a spot onto Tony for his introductory scene. I had been worried that the strangeness of Susan's words and the tension of the entire rehearsal process would leak into the show itself, but I found myself falling into the easy, practiced motions of a job I loved, using technology to bring the stage to life. Nothing went wrong until the last scene before we went on intermission. The scene in question was supposed to be a dramatic cliffhanger, where Susan's character discovers Tony's character has relapsed into his alcoholism, and the two have a huge altercation. The stage was supposed to go black right before they hit each other in an anticipatory moment of tension. Except, when the lights faded back up onto the scene, no one was on the stage. There was a beat of silence, then another. Someone in the audience coughed. I had a spot trained on the bed, where Tony was supposed to be sitting with his glass bottle props. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Emptied prop beer bottles scattered artfully around the stage, bed rumpled in such a way as to make it look like someone had been tossing and turning on it all day, fake cigarette butts everywhere. So where the hell were Tony and Susan? I looked over a ways to the far end of the catwalk, where another techie was ready with a spot for when Susan was supposed to enter. I gave him a questioning look, and he shrugged, eyes wide. The audience was starting to whisper uncertainly now. I was glad I wasn't backstage. Mendoza would have been on a silent warpath. I was about to try and signal that we should contact Rosanna, try to figure out what was happening, when Susan walked out on stage. I almost sighed in relief, but caught myself. There was something so obviously wrong with her. Her hair was disheveled, and her feet were bare. She swayed slightly as she walked disjointedly to center stage. Of course, my first thought was, oh God, she's high. My second thought was, what's she wearing? She wasn't in costume. Susan was wearing what looked like thick black bracelets around her wrists and ankles, and a thick black choker necklace. A thick black band wrapped around her waist. Not jewelry, I realized with sudden dread. Cables. Those are cables. The audience was quiet. No doubt they thought this was part of the show. I looked over at my coworker again, and he looked just as confused and scared as I did. Susan didn't say anything as she stood there on stage. She just stared upward and blinked slowly. Her mouth was twisted in what looked like a silent scream. She raised her arms suddenly, and I found myself flinching backwards. Shapes moved in the corners of the stage. The rest of the main cast was shuffling out to stand on either side of Susan, a terrible jumble of awkward, forced steps and unfocused eyes. Every one of them, I saw, had black cords wrapped tightly around their limbs. Even this didn't make me quite so scared. This was weird, but I reasoned it could be a protest, or a strike, or even some secret stunt Mendoza had cooked up and kept from everyone but the cast. It was what I felt on my legs that started me panicking. I felt a strange, shuffling sensation against my slacks, like a tugging, or something rubbing against my calf. When I looked down, I saw the cables moving. Not like they were moving on their own, you understand. More like, you know when you're pulling on a long, long rope and the slack starts to unwind and slide across the floor as you pull it? That's what it looked like. Like the cables had been stationary for long enough, and now someone, or something, was pulling on them finally, and the slack was tightening. I knew I wasn't the only one seeing it. My coworker on the opposite side of the catwalk was staring in open-mouthed horror at the wall nearest to him, where masses of cords were sliding down and out of sight. The ones by my legs were moving faster, more urgently. I was frozen in terror. Even the audience had caught on that something was not right. They were murmuring again, but not the slightly judgmental murmur of an audience believing something had gone wrong with the play. It was the uncertain murmur of a crowd beginning to feel the edges of fear. All at once, everything became silent. There was a moment where nothing happened, and it seemed like the whole world held its breath. then the entire cast began to scream. The moment they began screaming, the cords, those terrible, awful cables that had multiplied mysteriously and exponentially during our time there, began whipping towards the stage. They twisted around the bodies of the actors, wrapping them up like a spider would wrap up prey. The actors tried to move, to run, to struggle, but if they did, there was a terrible snapping noise, and their arm would bend in ways arms should not bend, or their legs would jut off at horrible angles. The audience was in a full panic now. I heard a man call for someone to put an end to the show. A woman shrieked in a high, shrill voice. I couldn't do anything except watch, paralyzed with horror. The actors' screams had been cut off as wires wrapped around their throats and mouths, and the only noises they could make were feeble little gurgles. There was a moment, just a moment, where I locked eyes with Susan before her face was entirely covered with cords. Her eyes were wide and desperate and pleading. Then she rolled her eyes upward, and I followed her gaze, though I have regretted it every day since. I wish I had not looked where she was looking. I wish I had not seen the thing I had felt lurking in the dark corners of the theater, the thing that had been spinning a web of strange cables and cords and wires, the thing that had ensnared the actors on stage. It is something I believe only I bore witness to, and it has haunted my nights since. How can I describe it in words? There are no words. All I can say is that when a spider grows to a certain size, it becomes impossible to tell where much of it is hiding, and I wonder if that is how it was able to conceal itself for so long. If it even was a spider. It was shaped like one, but I have never seen a spider encompass the entire ceiling of a space. I have never seen a spider made entirely of glistening, twisted cords and gangrenous masses of cables, and I have never seen a spider move with such satisfied viciousness as this one did when it descended upon the poor, cocooned actors just before all the lights in the theater went dark. Screams and wails pierced the air. By the time we managed to get the lights working again, the cast was entirely gone. The ceiling was bare. Every trace of wire and cord was utterly non-existent. After evacuating the theater, no one was really sure what happened. Audience interviews from the media ranged from "it was an elaborate stage hoax" to "the main cast all killed themselves at the same time." In the end, no one could decide what exactly happened. The supporting cast, the extras, I mean, they got out all right, but most of them refused to talk to news sources. One or two of them gave statements, but their stories were just as conflicted as the rest. But I remember. I remember the look in Susan Kenyon's eyes right before she was devoured, and I remember the creature that consumed her. The Blackbird was shut down permanently, of course. It went down in history as both an enormous success and a colossal tragedy, and the disaster of the cast members' deaths is infamous. I only wanted to share my side of the story now, because I doubt I have many years left in me. Someone deserves to know the truth of how those people died. Maybe now I'll be able to sleep at night. What a wonder that would be. Statement ends. Mr. Conlan did pass away about 3 years after giving this statement, in 2004. It seems he had a heart attack while visiting his granddaughter. He was 71 years old. There's not a ton to follow up with here, as the events described in this statement are both quite old, and already well documented. As Mr. Conlan said, the Blackbird stage production disaster was an infamous event in the theater world. There are tons of news reports on the incident from the actual time period, as well as countless documentaries, blogs, and video essays on the internet, analyzing the event and coming up with theories as to what exactly happened. The original production took place in the Goodman Theater in Chicago, and while I'm sure Amita would love for us to investigate the site of the incident itself, we simply don't have the time or the funds to do so. This statement will unfortunately have to be filed into our unsolved cases. Something to note, however. Several accounts exist online of people who currently work at this theater, and many of these accounts claim to see ghosts or spirits of the dead cast members of the Blackbird. While generally these accounts seem to be fictitious, it is worth mentioning that perhaps once or twice, someone will claim to have seen thick, black cables stretching into the corners of the theater. Cables that lead to nothing, and seem to have shown up out of nowhere. End recording.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast written by Jonathan Sims and produced by Alexander J. Newall and distributed by Rusty Quill. Story, characters, and ideas written about in this fan-made project belong to Rusty Quill. The Usher Foundation is a fan-made project written by Rashmi Phillips and Mari. All audio used in this project was Creative Commons Use Audio. Special thanks goes to Greg Epps for voicing the character Richard Carlsberg. Thank you for listening.